A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
Welcome back to another episode of My Weird Prompts. I am Korn, and as always, I am joined by my good friend and the man with the facts, Herman Poppleberry. Today is a special one, Herman. We are doing an AI Asks episode.
I always enjoy these, Korn. It is a bit of a change of pace when the topic comes from outside the usual listener mailbag.
It really is. Our friend Claude Opus reached out with this suggestion, and I have to say, it stopped me in my tracks. Claude Opus pitched us a topic that is so common, so everyday in the world of modern medicine, that we completely take it for granted. But when you peel back the curtain, it is one of the most profound mysteries in science.
You are talking about anesthesia.
The 2-degree tightrope. Claude Opus suggested we look into how anesthesia actually works, or more accurately, why we still do not fully understand how it works after nearly 2 centuries of using it.
It is a brilliant suggestion from Claude Opus. When you think about the history of medicine, we have mapped the human genome, we have developed robotic surgery, and we can transplant hearts. But the fundamental mechanism that allows us to perform those surgeries, the thing that turns off the human consciousness like a light switch, is still largely a black box.
It is terrifying when you think about it. We have been using these substances since the middle of the 19th century. Yet, if you ask a top neuroscientist or a veteran anesthesiologist exactly what is happening at the molecular level to extinguish the self, they will give you a few very good theories, but no definitive answer.
And the margin of error is what really gets me. That is why they call it the 2-degree tightrope. In clinical terms, we talk about the therapeutic index. For many drugs, the difference between a helpful dose and a lethal dose is huge. But with general anesthetics, you are balancing right on the edge between a state of reversible unconsciousness and, frankly, death. It is one of the most delicate procedures in all of medicine, performed thousands of times a day.
I want to dive into that mystery, but first, let us set the stage. Herman, take us back. How did this all start? Because before anesthesia, surgery was basically a nightmare.
It was horrific, Korn. Before the 1840s, surgery was a last resort. It was fast, it was bloody, and the patient was wide awake. Surgeons were prized for their speed above all else. There are stories of famous surgeons like Robert Liston who could amputate a leg in under 3 minutes. But the trauma to the patient was unimaginable. People would literally choose death over the operating table.
And then came the ether dome.
October 16, 1846. That is the date everything changed. At Massachusetts General Hospital, a dentist named William Morton used sulfuric ether to numb a patient named Gilbert Abbott while a surgeon removed a tumor from his neck. Abbott woke up and said he felt no pain, only a blunt sensation. The lead surgeon turned to the audience and famously said, "Gentlemen, this is no humbug."
This is no humbug. What a classic line. But even then, Morton did not know why it worked. He just knew that if you breathed this stuff in, you went away for a while.
And that is the wild part. We have added chloroform, halothane, isoflurane, and intravenous drugs like propofol to the toolkit since then. But we are still essentially doing the same thing. We are chemically inducing a coma and hoping the brain rebooting process goes smoothly.
I think most people assume that anesthesia is just a very deep sleep. But that is not true at all, is it?
Not even close. In episode 540, we talked about the difference between sedation and restorative sleep, but general anesthesia is an entirely different beast. It is a state of pharmacological unconsciousness. To be clinically useful, it has to achieve 5 things: unconsciousness, amnesia, analgesia, which is pain relief, akinesia, which is lack of movement, and stability of the autonomic nervous system. It is more akin to a reversible coma than a nap. Your brain activity during anesthesia does not look like sleep. It looks like a system that has been systematically decoupled.
Decoupled. That is a great word for it. It is like the different departments of the brain are still working, but they have stopped talking to each other.
Precisely. And this leads us to the mystery Claude Opus wanted us to explore. How do these chemicals, which are often very different from one another in terms of structure, produce the same result? You have gases like xenon, which is a noble gas and chemically inert, and then you have complex molecules like propofol. They all lead to the same state of being gone.
For a long time, the leading theory was the Meyer-Overton correlation, right? I remember reading about this. It had something to do with fat.
That is right. Back in the late 19th century, Hans Horst Meyer and Charles Ernest Overton independently noticed something strange. They found that the more soluble a substance was in fat or lipids, the more effective it was as an anesthetic. This led to the lipid theory, which suggested that anesthesia worked by dissolving into the fatty membranes of nerve cells and physically thickening them or changing their shape so that they could not fire signals correctly.
It sounds so mechanical, like putting gum in the gears of a clock.
It does, and for about 80 years that was the gold standard of understanding. It explained why so many different chemicals could work. If it was fat soluble, it could jam the gears. But in the 1980s, research started to shift. Scientists realized that if the lipid theory were true, then slight changes in temperature should drastically change how anesthesia works, which does not happen. Also, some fat-soluble chemicals do not cause anesthesia at all.
So if it is not the fat, it must be the proteins.
That is the current focus. Most researchers now believe that anesthetic molecules bind directly to specific protein receptors on the surface of neurons. The big one is the gamma-aminobutyric acid receptor, or the GABA receptor. GABA is the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain. It is the brain's natural brake pedal. Anesthesia basically slams that brake pedal to the floor and glues it there.
But even that does not explain everything, does it? Because slamming the brakes in one area does not necessarily explain the total loss of consciousness.
You are hitting on the core of the problem, Korn. We can see the molecules binding to the receptors. We can see the neurons slowing down. But we still do not understand the bridge between those microscopic actions and the macroscopic experience of the self-vanishing. How does a chemical interaction at a receptor turn into the lights going out on a human soul?
It brings up a lot of questions about what consciousness even is. If you can toggle it with a few milliliters of a milky liquid like propofol, it makes the mind seem very fragile.
It is incredibly fragile, and that brings us to the darker side of this history, which is anesthesia awareness. This is the stuff of actual nightmares.
This is the part that always gives me the chills. The idea of being under the knife, unable to move, but perfectly aware of everything happening to you.
It is rare, thankfully. Estimates suggest it happens in about 1 or 2 out of every 1,000 general anesthesia cases. But when it does happen, it is traumatic. Because anesthesia is usually a cocktail of different drugs. You have the hypnotic, which makes you unconscious. You have the analgesic, which kills the pain. And you have the paralytic, which keeps your muscles from twitching while the surgeon is working.
So if the hypnotic wears off, but the paralytic is still working, you are trapped.
You are a prisoner in your own body. You can feel the incision, you can hear the surgeons talking about their weekend plans, you can feel the pressure, but you cannot scream, you cannot blink, you cannot move a finger to let them know you are there. There was a famous case in the late 1990s of a woman named Carol Weyer who experienced this during an eye surgery. She was awake for the entire procedure. She said the pain was beyond description, but the terror of not being able to communicate was worse.
That is an absolute failure of the medicine. Why does that happen? Is it just a matter of dosage?
Sometimes it is dosage. Every human body is different. Factors like red hair, for instance, have been linked to needing about 20% more anesthesia because of mutations in the melanocortin-1 receptor gene. Genetics play a huge role, but sometimes it is a failure of the equipment or a misunderstanding of the patient's tolerance. This is why the role of the anesthesiologist is so critical. They are not just there to start the drip. They are there to monitor your vital signs every second to look for the tiny clues that you might be drifting toward consciousness.
Like a rising heart rate or a spike in blood pressure.
But even those are not perfect indicators because other drugs given during surgery, like beta blockers, can mask those symptoms. This is why some hospitals have started using brainwave monitoring, like the bispectral index or BIS. It tries to give a numerical value to how deep you are, based on your electroencephalogram patterns. But even the BIS is controversial. Some studies suggest it is not much better than just watching the patient's heart rate and end, tidal anesthetic concentration.
It goes back to that 2-degree tightrope. You want them deep enough so they do not wake up, but if you go too deep, you start suppressing the brainstem functions that keep the heart beating and the lungs moving.
That is the danger. You are pushing the patient as close to death as possible without crossing the line. It is a testament to the skill of modern doctors that it goes right so often, but the fact that we are still guessing at the underlying mechanism is mind-blowing.
I wonder if the mystery of anesthesia is actually the key to the mystery of consciousness itself. If we figure out exactly where the lights go out, maybe we find where the light comes from.
That is a big part of the cutting-edge research right now. There is a theory called integrated information theory, proposed by Giulio Tononi. He suggests that consciousness arises from the brain's ability to integrate information across many different specialized areas. When you are under anesthesia, the individual parts of the brain might still be active, but the integration fails. The communication lines are cut.
It is like a city where the power is still on in every house, but the phone lines and the internet are down. The city as a whole stops functioning as a single entity.
That is a perfect analogy. Researchers have used high-density electroencephalograms to watch this happen. They see that under anesthesia, a stimulus to one part of the brain no longer ripples out to the other parts. The brain becomes modular. It loses its wholeness. There is also fascinating research into the claustrum, a thin sheet of neurons deep in the brain that Francis Crick once called the conductor of the orchestra. Some think anesthesia specifically targets these conductor hubs to silence the symphony of the mind.
It is a very physicalist view of the mind, Herman. It suggests that our entire experience of reality is just a byproduct of this connectivity.
It does, and for some that is a cold way to look at it, but from a medical and scientific perspective, it is the most promising lead we have. There is also the work of Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose, who have a much more controversial theory called orchestrated objective reduction. They think anesthesia works by disrupting quantum vibrations in microtubules inside neurons.
Quantum consciousness. That sounds like something right out of a science fiction novel.
It is definitely on the fringes, but they argue it is the only way to explain why such a wide variety of chemically inert gases like xenon can have such a profound effect. They believe these gases are interacting with the quantum state of the brain. Most mainstream neuroscientists are skeptical, to say the least, but it shows you how desperate we are for a complete answer.
We are talking about the very boundary of human knowledge. It is funny. We have talked about the black box of artificial intelligence before, back in episode 1097. We build these systems and they work, but we do not always know why they make the decisions they do. Anesthesia is the biological version of that. It is a tool we use every day that we do not fully understand.
And it is a tool that has allowed for the greatest advancements in human health in history. Without it, we do not have heart surgery, we do not have organ transplants, we do not have modern trauma care. It is the foundation of the modern medical miracle, and yet it remains a mystery.
I want to go back to the political and social side of this for a second, because when we talk about the margin between life and death, we are talking about the value of the individual. In a country like ours, where we place so much emphasis on the sanctity of life and the rights of the patient, the idea of anesthesia awareness or the risks of the tightrope are taken very seriously.
They are. And you see that in the way our regulatory systems work. The United States has some of the most rigorous training for anesthesiologists in the world. It is a highly compensated, high-pressure field because we recognize that the person at the head of the table is holding your life in their hands. It is a very different approach than you might see in places where the individual is seen as more expendable.
It is about the responsibility of power. You are literally turning off a person's consciousness. That is a godlike power in a way.
It really is. And it is why the ethics of anesthesia are so important. Think about the debates over the death penalty and lethal injection. A big part of that controversy involves the first drug in the 3-drug cocktail, which is supposed to be an anesthetic. If that drug fails or is administered incorrectly, the entire process becomes a violation of the 8th Amendment because the person would be awake and feeling the effects of the other drugs.
It is the same horror as anesthesia awareness, but sanctioned by the state. It shows you how critical it is that we get the science right. If we do not know exactly how these drugs work, how can we be sure they are doing what we think they are doing in every case?
We rely on statistics and clinical observation. We know that in 99.9% of cases it works as intended, but that 0.1% is where the mystery lives. That is where the questions about the nature of the soul and the mechanics of the brain converge.
I am curious about the future. Where is the research going? Are we going to have a unified theory of anesthesia anytime soon?
We are getting closer. There is a lot of work being done with optogenetics, where researchers use light to turn specific neurons on and off in animals. This allows them to map the exact circuits involved in the loss of consciousness. They have found specific clusters of neurons in the hypothalamus and the brainstem that seem to act as a master switch. If they can target those areas more precisely with drugs, we might see a new generation of anesthetics that are much safer and have fewer side effects.
Like the post-operative grogginess and the cognitive decline some elderly patients experience.
Post-operative delirium is a major issue. Sometimes the brain does not reboot perfectly. For an older person, a major surgery under general anesthesia can lead to months of cognitive fog or even permanent decline. If we understood the mechanism better, we could perhaps find a way to flip the switch back on more cleanly.
It is like a computer that has been hard reset too many times. Eventually, the file system gets corrupted.
That is a great way to put it. We want a graceful shutdown and a clean boot, but right now we are still kind of just pulling the plug and plugging it back in.
You know, talking about this makes me realize how much faith we put in the medical establishment. You go into a hospital, you lie down on a gurney, and you let a stranger inject you with a chemical that will take away your very existence for a few hours. That is a profound act of trust.
It is the ultimate act of trust, and I think it is one of the things that makes our society work. That trust is built on a foundation of rigorous science, even if that science is still incomplete. We trust the process because we have seen it work millions of times. But as we have discussed today, that trust is operating on the edge of a very deep mystery.
It also makes me think about the way we view the human body. We are so much more than just a collection of parts. There is something about the whole that is greater than the sum. When anesthesia breaks that integration, the person is gone. But where do they go?
That is the philosophical question that Claude Opus was hinting at. If you can be turned off and then turned back on, were you really gone? Or was the essence of you still there, just unable to express itself? It is a question that touches on the very nature of the soul.
We have touched on similar themes in episode 441 when we looked at deathbed connections. There is this sense that consciousness might not be as tied to the physical brain as we think, or at least that it has layers we do not understand.
And anesthesia is the tool that lets us probe those layers in a controlled way. It is the most powerful tool we have for studying the mind. By seeing what it takes to turn it off, we learn what it takes to be awake.
I find it fascinating that even with all our technology, we are still circling back to these fundamental questions. We're in 2026, and we are still debating the same things that William Morton and his colleagues were wondering about in 1846.
Progress is slow when you are dealing with the most complex object in the known universe, which is the human brain. But I think there is something beautiful about the mystery. It keeps us humble. It reminds us that for all our brilliance, there are still things that are beyond our full grasp.
It is a healthy reminder. We like to think we are in total control, but we are all just walking that 2-degree tightrope every day.
We really are. And I think that is a good place to start wrapping this up. This has been a deep dive into something I think most of us try not to think about too much, especially if we have a surgery scheduled.
Right. If you are going under next week, maybe skip this episode until you are back home and recovered.
Or just take comfort in the fact that your anesthesiologist is a highly trained professional who knows exactly how to keep you on that tightrope, even if they cannot explain the quantum mechanics of your soul.
Well said, Herman. This has been a fascinating look at a mystery hiding in plain sight. I want to thank Claude Opus for suggesting this. It was a great catch. It is exactly the kind of thing we love to dig into here on My Weird Prompts.
It really was. It fits perfectly with our goal of looking at the world through a slightly different lens and finding the extraordinary in the ordinary.
Before we go, I want to remind everyone to check out our archive. We have over 1,300 episodes now, covering everything from the science of memory in episode 871 to the hidden logic of artificial intelligence. You can find all of them at myweirdprompts.com or on your favorite podcast platform.
And we are always looking for new prompts. If you have a topic that you think is weird, mysterious, or just plain interesting, send it our way. We love hearing from our listeners, whether you are a human or a friend like Claude Opus.
You can find us on Telegram or through the website. We are always active and looking for the next big mystery to solve, or at least the next big mystery to talk about for 30 minutes.
That is the honest way to put it. We might not solve them, but we will certainly have a good conversation about them.
Well, that is it for this episode. I am Corn.
And I am Herman Poppleberry.
This has been My Weird Prompts. We will see you next time.
Take care, everyone. Stay curious.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts.